Our first speaker is from Electronic and Electrical Engineering, Seb Savory.
Hiya, so I'm going to talk about how to mark 100 assignments and give feedback in an hour. You know, that classic problem we want to do. Right, so the real problem is in that engineering mathematics, what we really want to do is give students regular assignments so that they sort of not just read the material, but actually engage with it and actually test their understanding. So what we also need to do is then give them very rapid feedback, because in maths, quite often what we're doing is we're building on concepts. So they have to have understood one concept, and then we then build on it and use it for the next concept. So we really need to give them very quick feedback. Waiting a month or even a couple of weeks is actually quite a long time in terms of their understanding. So what we want to try and do is give almost near instant feedback. So in 2007, when we took over teaching the maths course, we went from, instead of having a mid-sessional which was worth 20% of the marks, we went to having a series of 10 assignments, each of which was worth 2%. We've changed that subsequently to 2 to 3 and had slightly fewer, but the basic idea is that they have regular assignments that they are doing, but then that puts on a lot of marking if we're not careful. So the possible solutions then to marking that and giving fast feedback, well, the first is to try and use computer-based marking. Generally you need to go for multiple choice though. Well, we didn't really explore that for 3 very good reasons at the time. First is you can only really check the final answer on a computer. It's very difficult to check the workings. And often it's the workings which is the key thing, because we want to just see, are they actually understanding? Getting the final answer, they could have got that by luck, but get everything else wrong. Second, we wanted to encourage that engineering disciplinarity, where they start off by doing a sketch, think about the problem, just seeing how they're relating to the problem. They're not just suddenly diving in using the maths, they're actually thinking about it a bit. And also when we started, this was back in 2007, it was sort of pre-Moodle, so we didn't really have the same options that we now have. Second option we could do is get academics to do the marking. It's always tempting, but the problem is for a half-course unit, it means our load for an academic goes up by about 300%, and that was not really deemed to be acceptable in terms of the hours required. Then another option is to use PhD students and postdocs. And that's actually what we started off with. We started off by using PhDs and postdocs when we first brought in assignments. But then again, the turnaround was variable. You could sometimes get them to do it in 2 weeks, but sometimes they'd have a crisis or a conference deadline, and it would slip to 4 weeks. And it's not as rapid as we'd like. So then we moved on to our next solution, which was to go for the parallel approach, parallel processing, i.e. peer marking. So what we do is we get all the students to mark each other's assignments in lectures, and then that means we can give them very rapid feedback. Rather than me spend at least a day doing 100 assignments, I get all the students to go through it in an hour. So the model is very much during a lecture, what I would do is I would, for example, present the ideal solutions, including the mark scheme, and then the students go through and mark, and quite often give comments on the scripts to their peers. One of the times when I realized peer marking was working very well is we feed all our scripts back to tutors. And one of the tutors said to me, I was really impressed by your last assignments. The comments you put on those assignments, very detailed. And I said, it's not me actually, it was the students. They're giving very good feedback to each other on these assignments. So we've gone through a number of iterations. So we really rolled out peer marking to begin with in 2008, having had a year's worth with the PhD students. So we first went with, we'd have a separate, so one day we'd have submission. They would have to submit their report, their assignments to the departmental office. We would then record them, see who'd submitted it, and then we would go to peer marking. So we peer marked, in this case, 5 out of 10. It was a new thing to try, so we didn't want to convert all of them to peer marking, so we just did half of them. What we would then do is we'd have a peer marking session, and in that peer marking session, we'd ask the students to come and collect an assignment, obviously not their own, and then they would mark that one. We'd actually give them an incentive to attend. We said, if you want to get full marks, you have to attend the peer marking session, and if you don't, we'll take away half your marks. You'll spot this draconian theme ongoing, and this is something I've learned about peer marking. You have to be slightly draconian. Even though we put in these sanctions, some students would hand in their coursework, but then not bother turning up to the peer marking, and automatically forfeit half their marks. The other thing you'd have is, because typically more people would hand in their coursework than would actually attend the peer marking, then we ended up with a mismatch, which then meant the academic was then responsible for still doing some marking. Never a great move. So then we went to the second iteration, and this was 2010, so we had a couple of years on that, just to see how it bedded down. And then we combined the submission deadline and the peer marking, again for 5 out of 10 of the assignments. So students arrive at the lecture and then swap with a neighbour. Peer marking then ensues, and then we get the mark script is then returned back to the student by the marker, and then the student then returns their mark script to the academic. There's a lot of benefits to swapping with a neighbour that we probably don't think about, and that's the case of they're going through it and they say, I don't understand what you mean there. And then there's that dialogue between the person who's writing it and the person who's marking it that we never normally get. They don't realise that they're not being very clear, whereas in that situation they're getting very quick feedback that what they've written isn't clear. In this case, again, because we were still rolling it out, we would check quite a few of the scripts at random just to see how their marking was, and also half of the scripts were being marked by PhD students, and so we'd compare how the marks were between the ones that had been marked in a peer session and the ones that had been marked independently in the serial approach. And we didn't find any particular variation between the two approaches. So we then went to our third iteration, which is where we are now. Okay. So we've now gone over to all assignments being peer marked. As per the second iteration, students bring their assignments to the lectures and then swap with a neighbour. We're gradually dropping down the number of assignments, in particular because other courses are starting to go for peer marking, and if we just leave it unchecked, then there's too much load on the students if we're not careful. Basically, they'll do a lot of work for very few marks, we've discovered. So we brought it down to 7, and we'll probably refine that down to maybe 6 in the subsequent year. So the current arrangement we have, for example, this is how my lectures are running this term. So I'd have a lecture on a Monday. On the Wednesday, I'd have another lecture and issue them with an assignment. They'd have another lecture on the Monday, and then on the Wednesday, they'd have a peer marking session. And then we'd repeat that cycle. So it's really saying, I've taught you a concept, I'm going to test you on that concept, and then then we'll move on to the next concept that's probably building on that previous concept. And that works its way through term. I mean, I found that really, the reason we're doing assessment really is to get people to engage with the material. No other reason at all. I mean, I discovered that this is really the way you have to do it, having done an OU degree while I was in industry at one point. And you realise you need that assessment just to make you do the work. You can read it and think you've understood it, but without actually assessing it, you don't really get very far. So issues with peer marking. Latecomers can be highly disruptive, and the solution to that is a clear set of rules. Students sometimes struggle with marking their peers' work. This I don't see as a problem. I see this as a bonus because it highlights to students the problem of presenting clear solutions. And often if it contains errors, you'll find the student will give feedback to their peers what they should have done, what they've done wrong, and they'll provide much more feedback probably than an academic would do, given the time of trying to turn around in a year 1,000 scripts. So the rules, this is what I would typically email out the day before a peer marking session. Okay, you have to put your name, your tutor's name on the front page, and it has to be stapled. And I will actually deduct marks if they don't. This sounds really petty, but not stapling it means it gets split up everywhere, and obviously not putting your tutor's name on means I've then got to go and hunt for it. These are admin things which I penalise because it then gets them into a good habit. I then tell them it will start exactly at 5 minutes past the hour. Latecomers will get 0 if I've already started marking that question. If I've started marking a question and presented the entire solution, they get 0. And this is kind of essential for avoiding the disruption of latecomers. And then I have some issues in terms of failure to attend. So there are some cases where I won't forfeit their entire marks. So, for example, if they're absent beforehand, they know they're going to be absent, they've got a very good reason, they can email me the solutions and I'll mark that for those rare occasions. A doctor-produced note for illness, and then obviously if there's a newsworthy or catastrophic problem with the public transport, which I can verify via TfL or train websites, then yep, I will make a concession in that case. But otherwise, yeah, I'm pretty strict about this. So it's draconian but necessary, I guess is the way I would say peer marking normally needs to be run. So while these rules might seem excessive, it's very necessary to avoid the disruption in latecomers have, because obviously we want people to come in and swap with a peer. So we have to do this slightly draconian. So if someone arrives late, what I will do is I will literally stop peer marking. I will then go over to that person who's arrived late. I will write on their script when they've arrived, how many questions we've marked, and then I will continue with the peer marking. So session 1 this term, 2 latecomers. Session 2, no latecomers. Everyone knows there's a strict set of rules and they're going to be applied. Again, it sounds draconian, but it's kind of almost what you need for peer marking, because these latecomers just are so disruptive. If you try doing peer marking and don't have this set of rules in place, they will arrive. You'll get someone who will arrive at 10 past, quarter past, and it just prolongs the agony of the thing. So in terms of final thoughts and observations, assignments are really useful in terms of getting students to engage with the lecture materials, and they will work disproportionately hard for 2 to 3% of their final exam marks. Submission at peer marking session and swapping with the neighbour works very well, because they also get their script back within that hour, so they're able to see how well they've done. Normally they do pretty well, actually. It's quite encouraging. Then the issue is in terms of the length of the assignment. It's quite good discipline to actually set an assignment that could be marked in 40 minutes. So it means you can't set an excessively long one, which then does help with the balancing across other courses, because you've got to set something that can be marked in 40 minutes, so you allow for 5 minutes at the start of the lecture and 5 minutes at the end in terms to do all the necessary admin, like getting people to swap, making sure they're stapled names on, etc., and also then handing them back in again. The other thing is peer marking encourages attendance at a tutorial session once a fortnight in the case of this term, and they see the ideal solutions presented, and they get feedback on how well they've attempted those in an hour. So yeah, so that's really my thoughts on peer marking. So any questions?
Thank you very much, sir. Any questions? Ben?
Just a quickie about the logistics of how the students get their own tests back. You said they were submitting them also to you. So how do you get the marks? How do they...
Okay, so what happens at the end of the lecture is they hand them all back to me, and then I will then distribute them back to tutors. I will then log on the marks in that case. That's something, you know, we are toying with the idea of getting an administrator to do that, but at the moment I'm just checking through, because there's 1 or 2 where they'll say, don't know the answer to this question, you'll have to check it, but it's maybe 2% of the papers will have that issue. But that's in terms of how we do it in terms of logistics. Yes?